Hello class, so we continue from where we left the last time, but before we look into today's lesson, let's just remind one another what we discussed in our previous lesson. We were looking at the German reactions to the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, I said that the Versailles Treaty was announced on the 7th May 1919, and it was signed by Frederick Abbott, the new chancellor by then, on 28th June 1919. However, initially the new government had refused to sign the treaty, even though it was later signed. In protest, remember, the Germans did not like the terms of the Versailles Treaty. So in protest, or in a way of demonstrating, they sank their own ships. And on top of that, there were other consequences, such as political assassinations. For instance, in the summer of 1922, Germany's Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau was murdered by extremists. There was also an attempted revolution, remember I said this, known as the Kapusch, which was however defeated. On top of that, just to show this how the political nature or political environment was like, in November 1923, Adolf Hitler led an attempted rebellion as well in Munich, which was known as the Munich Push. For more on this, you can see or read on page 253 in your history books. You should know that the Germans hated the Versailles Treaty. They felt that the Versailles Treaty was a forced diktat. By this I mean that there was no representation from the German side. This was just a treaty which was forced on them. They had no say, or they had nothing to bargain, but just to accept the terms of the Versailles Treaty. Moving on, today we'll be looking at another consequence as a result of the Versailles Treaty, which was forced on Germany. This led to hyperinflation. Before we discuss the hyperinflation, remember Germany had to pay £6,600,000 as reparations or as damages for the war. This is what led to the hyperinflation. What is hyperinflation? This is a term to describe rapid or excessive and out of control general price increases in an economy. When goods just increase rapidly, let's say you want to buy something today, it's 100 kwacha. In the next day, few hours, 200 kwacha, 300 kwacha, 400 kwacha. Goods and prices just increasing rapidly. This is what we call a hyperinflation. And as a result of this hyperinflation, which came as a result of the term of the Versailles Treaty, reparations, the government solved the problem of not having money by simply printing extra money. So there were a lot of money, the government was printing a lot of money that people had to carry money in bags just to shop or just to buy essential goods. Eventually the money was useless, so did the prices rise up. For instance, prices of goods could rise between joining the back of the queue in a shop and reaching the front. You are on a queue, you are trying to buy essential goods, can be soap, sugar, anything in a shop, and you are standing on a line, by the time it's your turn to buy the essential goods, the prices would have risen up. So that was the nature of the inflation in Germany. Wages began to be paid daily instead of weekly. By wages, I mean salaries of workers. They had to be paid weekly now, daily, instead of weekly. It means that because the money was being produced rapidly, so it had to be disposed of rapidly. So the more money was being produced, the more it had to be spent on goods and services. Moving on. Of course, some Germans gained from this disaster. For instance, the government and industrials were able to pay off their huge debts. Pensioners, however, suffered the most because their money became useless. It had devalued. So they were practically left penniless. By penniless, I mean they were practically left with nothing. It was only the prosperous middle class family that would find their same. For instance, prosperous families or middle class people would find their savings, which might have bought a house. By the time it got to 1923, they say the value of their savings could not even afford to buy a loaf of bread. Just to explain further on this, families would save up money as savings over years, saving up savings. But by the time it was 1923, the savings that they had made, if there were millions in that time in 1991, when it got to 1923, the same millions could not buy a house, but rather just buy a loaf, could not even be enough to buy a loaf of bread. So that was the nature of the disaster. Now, in our next class, we'll be looking at the Ruhr, the conflict in the Ruhr. I want you to look at your books. Open page 16 of the history book. Read about the conflict in the Ruhr. When you have read about the conflict in the Ruhr, make your own short notes and try to present it to your parents or to anyone you're with. That way you are also building on your presentation skills and note making skills. For today, we end here. Thank you very much.